My name is Ben Horne, and in this video we're going to talk about how to store film, how to load film, and the different types of film that I use for my large format color landscape photography work. So when it comes to storing film, you want to store it in a very cool environment. Many people like to store it inside of a refrigerator. I have a dedicated freezer that I store my film in. It's just important to protect the film from condensation. So I take my boxes of film, I put it inside a dry bag and put it inside the freezer. That way, in case power is shut off and some of the ice that's in the freezer melts, I don't have to worry about that water damaging the film, because I've had that happen in the past and that wasn't really fun since the film is pretty expensive. So Ziploc bags are fine if it's in a refrigerator, but if it's in the freezer, I do recommend a full-on dry bag just to give that extra level of security. When it comes to loading film, this is something that some photographers, including myself, like to complain about, but it's not because it's hard to do. It's actually really simple to do, but you need to really keep your mind focused on what you're doing. So to load film, you need to have either a completely dark room without even the slightest bit of light, which is not the easiest to come by, or you need to have a film changing bag. What I use is a film changing tent. So this is a Harrison film changing tent. This is the 8x10 size. They also make a size that's really ideal for 4x5. But honestly, the 8x10 would be a really good size, even with 4x5, because you get some more room to work. Because even with 8x10 film, it's a little bit cramped in there. But that allows me to load film whether I'm out in the field or whether I'm at home, and it works out really well to keep everything nice and secure while loading the film. When it comes to the process of loading the film, it's important to stay organized. So it's good to label your film holders. This one is 2A, the back side is 2B. I label them so that way I always use the A side first, and then I will use the B side. In case I put the dark slide in the wrong way, it allows me to catch that a little bit later down the line. So the dark slides are labeled. One side is black, as you'll see here. The other side will have a light color on it. This is a Toyo film holder. Each film holder might be a little bit different as far as the different brands, but they do show a difference between one side or the other. You'll need to have your own system as far as how you like to keep everything organized. But my system is that if I have the light colored side on the outward side of the film holder, it means that there is a sheet of unexposed film in there. If the black side is facing outward, it means that either it is exposed film or there's no film in there. In either case, it's not a side of the film holder that I'd want to use. To load the film, I start by already swapping my dark slides to the light position like this, obviously with no film loaded in there. I'm going to do the other side as well. I'm going to flip this around like there. Now, you will certainly need to be loading the film in complete darkness, but just to show here as an example, I have decided to destroy some sheets of film here just to kind of show the whole process in the light. So I do not pull the dark slide all the way out. I open it just enough so that I'm able to access the important parts. Then you flip this guy open right here, and the film is going to have a notch in it. So there's a notch right there up in the corner. This will show you not only the type of film it is, but also it'll show you the orientation of the film. Whenever you load the film in the holder, you want to make sure that the notch is going to end up right here in this corner. To load the film, you're going to drop it underneath the guides like this, and I always feel for these little edges right here, because if I can feel these little edges, it means that I have the film underneath the film guide as opposed to being inside the track where the dark slide goes. Now I just make sure that I drop it in there all the way and then close it. I always feel one more time just to make sure I feel those edges right in there. And you go ahead and close the dark slide. And we're going to do the same thing for the other side. Now keep in mind, it's a lot easier showing this on camera than it is loading it for the first time in a changing bag. But one of the things I've learned is that it's a really good idea to close your eyes when you're loading the film, because it allows you to concentrate on exactly what you're doing. And also I do recommend going through and double checking your work once everything is loaded in there. So once I have it loaded, I'll go through, I'll pop it back open one more time, I'll make sure it's all the way down there, I'll feel for the little notch right there, then close it back up just like that. Once you have the film loaded, you want to make sure that these are very carefully handled in full daylight. They are sealed against full exposure to daylight, but you don't want to really risk it, so don't let them just kind of sit out. kind of shield it as much as you can. And try to limit the time that it is inside the camera with the dark slide pulled, just in case you do happen to have some sort of a leak in your film holder. And if you do ever have an issue where you notice a light leak in your photos, it is a good idea to note which film holder you use to shoot a certain photo so you can kind of track that down a little bit easier after the fact. And I've had some film holders in the past that started leaking a little bit, so I ended up retiring those film holders and I simply replaced them with new ones. Now when it comes to film, there's 3 different film stocks that I have in my rotation as a color landscape photographer, but there's 2 different types of film that I use. So I use color negative film, which is going to be Ektar 100, and then I also like to use slide film, and for that I use Fuji Velvia 50 and Fuji Provia 100. The difference between color negative film and color slide film has to do with how it relates to the extreme contrast of a situation. If I'm taking a picture in a very low contrast situation, so let's say I'm photographing into the shade, there's no direct sunlight, and it's not an extremely contrasty subject, slide film does really well in these situations, and my #1 film to use is Fuji Velvia 50. It is a very high contrast film, it has high saturation, but if you photograph subjects in kind of subdued light, you're going to have actually a very natural rendition of the subject. It's only really if you use that film in a really high contrast scene that the colors have a tendency to go a little bit cartoonish at times. I do try to avoid that. If I'm going to be using slide film for a situation that has a little bit more contrast to it, oftentimes I'll use Fuji Provia 100, which is less contrast and less saturation. It deals with those situations a little bit better without going a little bit too cartoonish for the color. Now, Kodak Ektar 100 is a color negative film. So when you get the film back from the lab, it's going to look kind of orange. You have a hard time kind of figuring out what you're looking at. But it has an enormous ability to expose for really bright highlights, yet hold the shadow detail in place. So this is a film they'll use if it's a very high contrast scene. So for example, sunrises and sunsets where you have some really bright areas in the sky as well as some kind of dark areas in the foreground, or some areas of reflected light in canyons where you have some bright areas and dark areas. It's almost impossible to overexpose Kodak Ektar 100 color negative film. You just want to make sure that you protect the shadows, that the shadows don't get too dark. When you really get into it, you're going to want to get yourself a spot meter because that will allow you to look at the brightness of the scene. You'll kind of know how it all translates. But the general rule of thumb for me is I use color negative film like Kodak Ektar 100 if it is a high contrast scene, and I will use slide film like Fuji Velvia 50 or Fuji Provia 100 if it is a low contrast scene. But that is the film I use for my color landscape photography. There's also a ton of options out there for black and white, and the Intrepid 4x5 is even compatible with wet plate photography. So I want to thank everyone for watching, and we'll see you around.